Okay, perfect. So hello everyone to our second session of this TBS colloquia. Today we will have Kristen Dage. I'm pronouncing it correctly, I hope so. Maybe not. She is a NASA fellow working with objects in extreme gravitational environments. Today she will tell us about stellar clusters and the connection in the intersection with the transient events. So please take it away.
Thanks for organizing this, Priscilla. I'm very excited to talk to you about how star clusters can intersect with time domain science, but I do have the very daunting task of trying to cover everything that the Star Cluster Science Working Group does. So I will try to get through all of that. And just to note that for the next month I'm at McGill, but as of September, I will be at Wayne State University, which is in Michigan. So if you want to talk star clusters, you know where to find me. I'm also very excited about this talk because I finally have the perfect opportunity to share this picture I took of Rubin under construction back in 2017. It's amazing to see how much it's changed since then. I'm super excited. And I also want to thank all of these people. These are members of the Star Cluster Science Working Group who shared some slides with me so that I could try to, you know, again, take this very daunting task of talking about all the possible exciting star cluster science. So this is the little pitch for anybody that's interested in star clusters, is that we love star clusters and we're always happy to meet people who also love star clusters. There's a lot of, very exciting and active collaboration happening within the group. And if you would like to join our group, please do. So as a sort of brief introduction, star clusters is a fairly broad term. Usually when people say star clusters, they're either talking about globular clusters, which are old, or young massive clusters, which are young. I'm giving an honorable mention to intermediate age clusters and open clusters. They are also kinds of clusters. They're not what I'm going to focus on today. And the other important, quantity to consider in star cluster science is galactic versus extra-galactic clusters. And there's this fundamental trade-off between the quantity of star clusters that you can have in your sample and the data quality. And I like these figures because you can see this is what a galactic globular cluster looks like. It's very pretty. There's a million bazillion stars. And then this is what an extra-galactic globular cluster looks like. It's a sad little blob. But on the other hand, the Milky Way has less than 200 globular clusters all told. And if you pick any elliptical galaxy like M87, that will have thousands of globular clusters in it. So this is, one of the things to think about. And then the other thing to introduce are what I like to call the 3 M's of globular clusters. And just to note that I did introduce young star clusters, but we're going to ignore them and focus on globular clusters. So the first M is that globular clusters are magical. So a consequence of globular clusters being this, really crowded and dynamical place is that you can have this really amazing formation mechanism for X-ray binaries. And so what's happening in the simulation on the left is that you can have 2 objects in a binary, and then a third object can pass by, and there will have this, amazing dynamical interaction. And you can see if you watch closely that one of the original pairs in the binary actually gets swapped out for the passerby. So this means that we just have a very different formation channel to form objects, and just a cornucopia of really amazing binaries. And another motivation for caring about X-ray binaries and globular clusters is that there is, a huge suggestion that this is the place where the merging black hole binaries that have been detected by LIGO, Virgo, Cagra may have formed, or their progenitors may have formed. So this is, lots of exciting stuff happening in globular clusters. The second M is that globular clusters are mature. Globular clusters are giga-years old. That means that all of their massive stars have died and turned into compact objects, and you're just left with a huge cluster of low mass stars. And so that means that if we see an X-ray binary in a globular cluster, we know that it has a low mass donor star. So we have some idea about the possible counterparts, which is nice. The third M is that globular clusters are mysterious. there's just so much about them we still don't know. And one of the things that has, sort of been puzzling the community, I would say, especially in the last 20 years, is this idea of multiple stellar populations. And so the assumption that all of the stars in globular clusters are just one population, we know observationally that's not true. There's this is from Nate Bastian's 2018 review article on multiple stellar populations, but we know that there, are probably a couple of different generations of stars within a cluster. And one of the things that's mysterious is we don't know how it can impact X-ray binary formation. So this is just exciting stuff on the horizon. And the nice thing is that there's this nice result from Eduardo Hartmann, who's been using the S+ data set to explore multiple stellar populations in galactic globular clusters, but it's clear that Rubin is going to be able to explore these populations further. So this is sort of my talk outline. So part one is I'm going to talk about optical variability within galactic globular clusters. I will talk about extra-galactic star clusters as hosts of multi-wavelength variability. And then part three, I will talk about how Rubin is going to revolutionize extra-galactic star cluster science and some of the challenges we will face along the way. I do have to caution at this point that this talk was put together from my extremely biased perspective, which is that I really like things that give off X-rays, and I really don't like the Milky Way. I have called the Milky Way pedestrian before. So if you are a fan of the Milky Way, I apologize. But let's get on. And then the other thing I'm super excited about is Carlos Corco, who is the SOAR operator at Cerro Pachón, takes these amazing pictures. And he said I could use some of his pictures of Rubin for my talk. This is one of his photos, and it's very exciting. Okay, so for optical variability within galactic globular clusters, again, because of my bias of not liking the Milky Way, I did shop around and ask around for some science cases to talk about. And I have to admit that, part of my motivation for talking about this is because if this is something you are interested in and you want to come discuss it at the Star Cluster Science Working Group, we would love to have you. So these next two science cases actually come straight out of the TVS roadmap. But one of them is that one of the things we'll be able to get is that we can do optical period measurements of counterparts to radio or X-ray sources. And then there's also going to be this possibility for identification of dwarf novae in the outskirts of globular clusters. And then the other thing that is possibly interesting is that this may provide constraints on the dearth of cataclysmic variables in globular clusters. So that's all exciting stuff. And one more thing is this Padua variables. And so there's this nice new result that shows that there's really this strong variability in extreme horizontal branch stars. So there's definitely a lot of mysterious, globular cluster science that has to do with variability, but this all hinges on our ability to detect things. And so this is where the crowded field task force comes in. And so it's going to be really an interesting problem. And so you can see on the left, this is a galactic globular cluster, my favorite 147 Tuc with HST. And you can see that, oops, what did I do? Oops, okay, there we go. So you can see that all of the stars here, it's just beautiful, like they're well resolved, and you can, pick out a fair number of them. This is an example. This is a ground-based image with the VLT. And so this is, I would say pretty good from the ground for now. And you can already see that at the core of the cluster, we're going to struggle to identify sources. And so we're going to, lack completeness, or maybe we're going to have huge error bars on the things that we detect towards the center, whereas on the outskirts of the cluster, as Liliana said in the TVS roadmap, we'll definitely be able to do things with variable stars there. But this is where this nice example that Massimo gave me for the effectiveness of the crowded field photometry task force. And so I don't remember which cluster this is, and you should talk to Massimo and the crowded field task force if you want to know more about it. But you can see that with their techniques, they've actually, so the OGLE 4 survey has picked out the yellow squares, and with their techniques, they have picked out anything with the red circle. So you can see that they have a bit more complete sample than the OGLE 4 survey with their nice fancy techniques, but they're also able to get these really beautiful light curves out. of the data. So that's definitely very promising and exciting for what we're going to be able to do with galactic star cluster science. But I'm going to move on to part 2 because I have a lot to cover, which is my favorite extra-galactic star clusters. And I still wanted to tie this into this, theme of understanding variability in time domain science. So of course, I have to caution again here is that there's also a lot of multi-wavelength variability that happens in galactic globular clusters, but the stuff that happens in the extragalactic star clusters is just so much cooler that I want to talk about that. So again, a little bit more on extragalactic globular clusters. So remember that they just look like little blobs in a ground-based telescope. They are not resolved at all. They can be slightly resolved in HST, and when we study them, we collect 3 parameters. So their stellar mass or their optical magnitude, so how bright they are in different filters, their metallicity, which we call color, because instead of measuring the metallicity of all of the stellar content properly, we take photometry in a redder filter and a bluer filter, and we subtract the difference. And if it's a bluer cluster or metal pore, then it will be it'll be more bright in the blue filter relative to the red filter, and so it'll have a lower color. And if it's a red or a metal rich cluster, then it'll be brighter in the redder filter than a metal poor cluster. We can tease more of this information out by spectroscopy, but with photometry, those are the 2 parameters that we can get. And sometimes, like when we use HST, we can also measure the half-light radius of the cluster. And I also just wanted to point out again that nice thing that was at the center of the image, that is the host galaxy. In this case, it's NGC 4472. It looks, kind of like the galactic clusters I was showing. That's not a cluster. Those little blobs are all our wonderful, beautiful clusters, but we have a gazillion of them, which is fantastic. And the other thing that's amazing about extragalactic science clusters is that they drive this really broad range of science cases. I made a little meme about it. But 3 of the science cases that they drive is, so one is that it has to do with dark matter, distance scales, and also high energy astrophysics, which again is, my bias coming out here. So really quick about the traces of dark matter. So this, I want to highlight work by Marta Reina Campos here. So she works on amosaic simulations that are exploring this, correlation between the distribution of globular clusters in a galaxy and the dark matter profile. This is something that has also been observed, and it's something that we're going to be able to explore a ton more with Rubin when we find all those beautiful, beautiful globular clusters. And if you want to read more about this, I highly suggest Marta's papers as a starting point. And I will move on to the extragalactic distance scale. And so as it turns out, there's this possibility of using the globular cluster population in a given galaxies to measure out the distances. So it's important for cosmology and all of that stuff. But the reason why I would care about it is that we need to know the distances to galaxies to understand their luminosity, to go after luminosity variability. So this is another exciting prospect that will come out of Rubin data and Rubin globular clusters. But the third thing that I am super chuffed about is that there is all sorts of amazing multi-wavelength variable sources in extragalactic star clusters. And the 2 things that I'm going to talk about very quickly before I move on to the next topic are fast radio bursts in globular clusters and ultraluminous X-ray sources in globular clusters. So fast radio bursts are just these mysterious, puzzling things that, make you go, what the heck? Because they're just these short pulses of radio emission that are picked up. Everyone thought that maybe they were affiliated with magnetars because they had found one affiliated with a magnetar in the Milky Way. And then in 2021, kind of blew our minds that one of them was found to be hosted by a globular cluster in M81. So because globular clusters are, again, these older populations, that's completely baffling. It would be very hard to have a magnetar in a globular cluster. And there are a few scenarios to explain it. One is that it may be tied to extreme X-ray binaries. It might also be a white dwarf merger. It's just super unknown, super exciting, and extra exciting that they found it in a globular cluster, because globular clusters are the best thing ever. And then of course my bias is really coming out here, but I think ultraluminous X-ray sources are really neat. These are objects that are ridiculously bright in X-rays. They might inform on the progenitors to black hole binaries. They might tell us something about the population of black holes or intermediate mass black holes and globular clusters. And it's just amazing that we find them in globular clusters at all. And they do weird things like this. This is one of my favorite sources ever. Its name is RZ2109. And we were doing analysis of about 20 years of Chandra and XMM light curves of it. And we found that it shows this amazing variability that lasts on the scale of about 4 hours. And it appears to be periodic on the scale of 1.3 days. This source is super weird and so hard to explain in many ways. But one of the explanations for this might be hierarchical triples. So you have two objects in a binary and then a third object, a tertiary, orbiting outside that is causing this time scale that we see. And I won't say anything more about it because I want to keep everyone's time in mind. But this is just a super exciting result. And it's so cool that we can actually probe hierarchical triples in clusters that are, 16 to 20 megaparsecs away. And then the other thing that I'm super jazzed about is that it has this really weird optical spectroscopy. So when we're doing optical spectroscopy here, we're taking a spectrum of the entire cluster. So we're taking it of all of the stars in the cluster. And let me see if I can get a laser pointer going. There we go. So what you're looking at here is this is the wavelength in angstroms, and then this is some arbitrary intensity. And these are a bunch of different spectra from 2009 to 2019. All of these wiggles here are all of the stars in the globular cluster that make up the globular cluster continuum. And this is its emission line. And this is just a weird emission line to have. It's oxygen emission line. We've modeled the cluster continuum and we've shown that there's no excess hydrogen. And so what this is telling us is that we have a source with so much oxygen and so little hydrogen that we think that the donor star is actually a carbon-oxygen white dwarf. So that means that this source is probably an ultra-compact X-ray binary. And by making comparisons to other ultra-compact X-ray binaries, we think that it has about a 5-minute orbital period. So this is just another really extreme system in a globular cluster. So after being blitzed through all of the different exciting science cases, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the challenges we're going to face, particularly in regards to extra-galactic cluster science. So all of this, the nice exciting science cases I mentioned, whether it has to do with cosmology, the distance scale, or understanding, weird transient and variable events hosted by globular clusters, would benefit from some systematic identification of extragalactic globular clusters. And this is where Rubin comes in really nicely, because it's going to provide this really, homogeneous sample and spatially extensive sample of globular clusters. And by the end of the planned survey, we should be able to do this for all of the galaxies that it will see out to about 100 megaparsecs. And so the question that we really need to think about here is, what techniques can we use to find all of the clusters? So I want to give an example of why a homogeneous data set is going to be amazing. And so this is M87. So this is the galaxy center in here. And this is a combined data set from a bunch of different surveys. And so these tiles are all from the NGVS survey, the Next Generation Virgo survey, led by Laura Ferrarese. This was taken probably 10 years ago, but you can see they've done a nice job tiling, part of M87. And then you can see that we have the ACS VCS data. So these are targeted by Hubble surveys. And then we also have information about foreground stars from Gaia and background galaxies from other surveys. But what it's lacking is this homogeneous coverage from one telescope. And so the filters that the ACS VCS used are not necessarily the same as the filters that the NGVS data used. And it's certainly not the spatially complete coverage of M87 like we're going to get with Rubin. And so because it's piecemeal, when we do studies where we try to find multi-wavelength counterparts to extra-galactic globular clusters, we often wind up being biased towards sources that are at the the centermost part of the galaxy. And that's because people have looked at the center of galaxies with Hubble most often, typically. And then the other important piece of information is that with a lot of ground-based surveys, they often target the outskirts of the galaxy and not the inside. So it just winds up being really piecemeal. So the way we identify clusters with photometry is we do color cuts. So this right here is a color magnitude diagram. And so this is showing this whole parameter space is what globular clusters fall into. So this is the optical color where we have subtracted a bluer filter from a redder filter, and then we'll plot it against one of the magnitudes and see where it falls. And so anything that falls in here is a globular cluster candidate. It's not confirmed. We confirm it with spectroscopy. So this is an example of a globular cluster spectrum. And then we would compare this to a template spectrum to measure a radial velocity and say, okay, yes, this is for sure a globular cluster and not a foreground star or a background galaxy trying to trick us. And then the other thing we can get out of Hubble, which is really nice, is that we can get some information about the size. And so even though when we select clusters with Hubble, we're not, they're still candidates, we're not confirming it with spectroscopy. We have this extra step of being able to fit the size to confirm that it's a globular cluster, not a star. And so what happens is that when you have an object that is slightly resolved, it will get convolved with the PSF, and so you'll get something like this. And I love this figure from Mark Peacock's 2012 paper. So what you're looking at here, this is what the PSF of a point source looks like, is this red dashed line right here. And then this is the model of our source after it's been deconvolved from the PSF, and you can see that it's actually a bit broader than a point source, but it's still not super broad. But yeah, we have these challenges because we can have stars, foreground stars and background clusters contaminating our samples. It's really hard to know how to handle statistically appropriately. And so the question I have always had is that we're going to have this huge data set. How can we do this systematically? And so one of the ways we can think about is either principal component analysis or machine learning techniques. And so I'm going to talk about a study that a couple of students who worked with me last year did. And so this is published in Barbicen et al. 2022. And so you can see that they combined all of these different data sets that I mentioned from all of these different telescopes. And so they used a spectroscopically confirmed globular cluster catalog to pick their test and training data set. And they used data from the NGVS survey, which is going to have very similar inputs to Rubin. And so they trained two different models on a random forest and neural network. And then after that, we wanted to ask these two questions, which is, do we trust the model when it says it can select the cluster well? And is there a way we can quantify how well they do it? And so one of the nice things about looking at M87, which has this huge wealth of data, is that we're able to use two different human selected catalogs using two different techniques, a photometric ground-based technique in the HST selection technique, to compare against their neural networks in the random forest. And so one thing that was so funny is that the neural network reported a very high percentage accuracy just on the test and training data set alone. And then we plugged in this completely different catalog than it was the same data set, but it was a different part of the data set. And the clusters were selected completely differently than how it was tested and trained. And it did a really, really good job of reselecting one of them, and it completely failed on the other method. And then the random forest was basically the opposite. It also reported this, high self-accuracy on the test and training data set. It did a really good job of reselecting one of the ground-based catalog. It failed on the cluster, the HST selected catalog. And so one of the, takeaways for the future is that I think that there's, really a good promise for using machine learning approaches to understand globular cluster candidates. And I think that, it's not going to improve on the, traditional technique necessarily of selecting globular clusters, but it's going to be able to do it so much more efficiently. And that's what we need for when we have a huge volume of data. But there's definitely a lot more work to do there. And then the other method I wanted to talk about for selecting clusters is work that is led by Ana Santos, who is also a member of the Star Clusters Science Working Group. And so these are some active ongoing projects. And so one of the questions that we have is, how does the diffuse galaxy light affect our ability to detect clusters? And you can imagine, if this is one of the host galaxies we have to deal with, what happens when we have clusters that are towards the innermost region, and how well will we be able to detect those, or what's our completeness? And so this is work that Nicholas Schrader-Souza is going to work on, which is really exciting. And then we want to, extend our methods to identify extra-galactic globular clusters in other types of galaxies. And so Nicholas, along with Pedro Lopez and Pedro Floriano, are putting together resources on existing confirmed globular clusters so that we can find them. And then Anna has also done some work with PCA selection of globular clusters, and she was kind enough to give me these slides. And so she looked at these 3 galaxies, so M82, NGC 3077, and M81. And she performed principal component analysis on, I think, 4 or 5 filters of globular clusters. And again, these are spectroscopically confirmed globular clusters. So we are very confident that these are truly globular clusters. And so she used the sample of 105 spectroscopically confirmed globular clusters to do the PCA, and then she ran the model, and out of 7,000 point light sources, she found 640 good globular cluster candidates. And one other note that's going to be really awesome is that, so Euclid was just launched, and so Euclid is going to have this very, very red filter, and Rubin is going to go into very blue wavelengths. And so when we combine the two of them, we're going to span just this huge broad range of the SED. And so that's going to be a really, really powerful way to know that we're more accurately getting things that we think are globular clusters. So, as a summary, there is a lot of star cluster science happening, both here in the Milky Way and in really distant galaxies. Rubin is going to just do all of this amazing stuff with star clusters, and we're just going to look at so many ridiculous different scales, and it's very exciting. So if you like star clusters, you should join us.
Thank you so much for such an amazing review talk, all the interesting targets that you presented. Thank you, all the attendees.